Why did Herod die? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 12, verses 20 to 25. Before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Acts chapter 12, verse 20. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 12, beginning at verse 20. Now Herod had been very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, but they came to him with one accord, and having made Blastus, the king's personal aide, their friend, they asked for peace, because their country was supplied with food by the king's country. So on a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat on his throne and gave an oration to them. And the people kept shouting, "The voice of a god, and not of a man." Then immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give God glory. And he was eaten by worms and died. But the word of God grew and multiplied. And it was Barnabas and Saul, and Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry. And they also took with them John, whose surname was Mark. In this chapter, we've seen the harassment of the church by Herod Agrippa I. He had the apostle James, the brother of John, executed, and almost had Peter executed. However, God intervened, sent an angel to release Peter, after which Peter fled to an unknown location. Herod was angry with this and had the guards executed before departing himself for Caesarea. Remember from chapter 10, Caesarea was the coastal city in Palestine where Cornelius lived. This is where we find Herod in today's reading. Verse 20 begins by telling us that before this time, Herod had been angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, two semi-independent cities under the Roman supremacy. Why he was angry with them, Luke doesn't tell us. But by the time we get to these events, they were coming to make peace with Herod, having even made Blastus, the king's personal aide, their friend. The reason they asked for peace was because they were supplied with food from the king's country. Biting the hand that feeds you is not often wise, so it is obvious why peace would be wanted to be had by the people of Tyre and Sidon. However, what happened as a result of this meeting would lead to the death of Herod. For on a set day, Herod arrayed himself in royal apparel, sat on his throne, and gave oration, or a speech, to them. Now, when we think of throne, we often think of a large chair located in the throne room of a palace where the king or queen would sit. This is not what is being discussed here. Rather, what is meant is a raised stage or platform where the judge or orator wishing to address an assembly would stand. The location would have been the theater in Caesarea, shown on the screen now. During this oration, the people present kept shouting that Herod was a god and not a man, a statement that Herod didn't refute. Recall back to chapter 10 when Cornelius bowed down to worship Peter. Peter said, "Stand up, for I am but a man." Herod could have done that here and saved his life, but he didn't. He accepted this praise. It is said that immediately the angel of the Lord struck him, meaning struck him with an illness, because he did not give God glory. Luke says that Herod was eaten by worms and died. The Greek word used for worm here is scolex, and is used to denote an intestinal worm. There are several cases in ancient history of such deaths, a death that is quite painful. Now we trust Luke is telling us the truth because we believe the Bible is inspired of God. But as Christians, we don't mind if the Bible is held up to scrutiny, for such can produce faith. Herod is not a religious figure in a biblical sense. He is a secular king, and not an insignificant one at that. His death, thus, should be recorded by those recording of the history of this time, which of course it was by Flavius Josephus, a Roman Jewish historian. And although we don't often read from secular works on this podcast, I want to make an exception here in order to show what Josephus, a non-Christian and a man who was not acquainted with the book of Luke, had to say of Herod's death. This quotation comes from Antiquities of the Jews 19.8.2. Quote, "Now when Agrippa had reigned 3 years over all Judea, he came to the city of Caesarea, which was formerly called Stratos Tower, and there he exhibited spectacles in the honor of Caesar, for whose well-being he'd been informed that a certain festival was being celebrated. At this festival, a great number were gathered together of the principal persons of the dignity of his province. On the second day of the spectacles, he put on a garment made wholly of silver, of a truly wonderful texture, and came into the theater early in the morning. There the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays, shone out in a wonderful manner, and was so resplendent as to spread awe over those that looked intently upon him. Presently his flatterers cried out, one from one place, and another from another, though not for his good, that he was a god, and they added, Be thou merciful to us, for although we have hitherto reverenced thee only as a man, yet shall we henceforth own thee as superior to mortal nature. Upon this the king neither rebuked them nor rejected their impious flattery. But he shortly afterward looked up and saw an owl sitting on a certain rope over his head, and immediately understood that this bird was a messenger of ill tidings, just as it once had been the messenger of good tidings to him, and fell into the deepest sorrow. A severe pain arose in his belly, striking with a most violent intensity. He therefore looked upon his friends and said, I, whom you call a god, am commanded presently to depart this life, while Providence thus reproves the lying words you just now said to me, and I, who was by you called immortal, am immediately to be hurried away to death. But I am bound to accept what Providence allots, as it pleases God, for we have by no means lived ill, but in a splendid and happy manner. When he had said this, his pain became violent. Accordingly, he was carried into the palace, and the rumor went abroad everywhere that he would certainly die soon. The multitude sat in sackcloth, men, women, and children, after the law of their country, and besought God for the king's recovery. All places were also full of mourning and lamentation. Now the king rested in a high chamber, and as he saw them below lying prostrate on the ground, he could not keep himself from weeping. And when he had been quite worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed this life, being in the 54th year of his age, and in the 7th year of his reign. He ruled 4 years under Caius Caesar. 3 of them were over Philip's tetrarch only, and on the 4th that of Herod was added to it. And he reigned, besides those 3 years, under Claudius Caesar, during which time he had Judea added to his lands, as well as Samaria and Caesarea. The revenues that he received out of them were very great, no less than 12 millions of drachmae. But he borrowed great sums from others, for he was so very liberal that his expenses exceeded his incomes, and his generosity was boundless." Unquote. Antiquities of the Jews was written in about 92 to 93 AD, while the book of Acts, we said, was written around 64 to 65 AD, meaning that Luke didn't have Josephus as a record yet to consult. Yet they are both in agreement with how Herod died, as well as the circumstances surrounding his death. People often wonder how we can tell that the scriptures are inspired. Well, one way is that it agrees with contemporary history when we have trustworthy secular history of that time. Josephus wasn't there, nor was he inspired, as he did make some mistakes, but his record on the whole can be trusted as relaying the history of the time. That Luke's history wasn't correct shouldn't surprise. Luke's history was correct shouldn't surprise us, for we believe the Bible to be inspired of God. But that Luke can be shown to match secular sources should strengthen our faith nonetheless. Herod's death didn't deter the gospel from spreading. In fact, it seemed to enhance it. The chapter ends by telling us that Barnabas and Saul, having fulfilled their ministry in sending aid to the churches in Judea, returned from Jerusalem, bringing with them John Mark, a man that we were introduced to in passing earlier in the chapter, and a man we'll learn a little bit more about in future lessons. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 13, verses 1 to 12, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.